Hey, today we're going to read The Printer. I want you to look at this cover. Think about what this story might be about. Remember that we're talking about memories, and that's the umbrella that we're under. Here is the back. It says, my father knew he had to tell everyone. He couldn't speak to a shout a warning, and even if he could, no one could hear him over the loud roar of the presses. But he could speak with his hands. Sounds pretty scary. There are different parts of the book we can look at. Look at that at the end. Let's read the acknowledgement here. To recreate the setting of the story, the press room of the New York Daily News in 1940, I was fortunate to have the cooperation of Sean Cox, who is known as that paper's institutional memory. I owe him thanks for his endless patience in taking me through the intricate process of creating, on a daily basis, over 2 million copies of what was at that time the most widely read newspaper in America. But more importantly, Sean's detailed descriptions of that long-gone press room brought a memory vividly back to mind. Once again I could see standing in that enormous room my father, the printer, in loving memory of Louis Alsberg, the printer, and his wife Sarah, my beautiful mother. My father was a printer. He wore a printer's four-corner newspaper hat. Every day after work he brought home the next day's paper. After reading it, it always folded a page into a small hat and gently placed it on my head. I would not take off my newspaper hat until bedtime. My father was deaf. Though he could not hear, he felt through the soles of his shoes the pounding and rumbling of the giant printing press that daily spat out the newspaper he helped create. As a boy, my father learned how to speak with his hands. As a man, he learned how to type to turn lead type letters into words and sentences. My father loved being a printer. That machine must have been the printing press. Can you imagine how loud that machine was? Huge. Sometimes my father felt sad about the way he was treated by his fellow co-workers who could hear. Because they couldn't talk to him with their hands, they seemed to ignore him. Years went by as my father and the hearing printers worked side by side. They never once exchanged a single thought. My father did not lack friends. There were other printers at the plant who were deaf. They also had learned to talk with their hands. One day while the giant presses ran, their noises shutting out all other sound, my father spotted a fire flickering in a far corner of the press room. The fire was spreading quickly, silently. Suddenly, the wood floor burst into flames. My father knew he had to tell everyone. He couldn't speak to shout a warning. This is the one from the back. Even if he could, no one could hear him over the loud roar of the presses. But he could speak with his hands. He did not hesitate. He jumped onto an ink drum and waved his arms excitedly until clear across the room he caught the attention of a fellow printer who also couldn't hear a sound. My father's hands shouted the terrible noise of the printing press. Fire! Fire! Tell everyone to get out! Tell the hearing ones! This is an interesting use of word shout. What part of your body do you normally shout with? How is it possible to shout with your hands? How is it possible to shout with your hands? Maybe with his mouth open, it's showing that he is saying it loudly and it's a very important message. I don't know. His friend climbed onto a huge roll of newsprint. His fingers screamed to the other deaf workers, Fire, fire, tell the hearing ones. All the printers who couldn't hear ran to the fellow workers who could. They pointed to the fire which had now spread to the wall next to the only exit. Newspaper is the paper on which newspapers are printed. Not one of my father's friends left until everyone knew of the danger. My father was the last to escape. By the time everyone had fled, the fire, feeding on huge quantities of paper, had engulfed the enormous plant. The giant presses, some still spewing out burning sheets of newspaper, had fallen partly through the floor. Great shafts of flame shot out the bursting windows. The printers stood in the street, broken glass at their feet. They embraced one another as the fire engines arrived. They were happy to be alive. My father stood alone, struck numb by the last image of the burning presses. The fire destroyed the printing presses. The plant had to close for repairs, but not one printer had been hurt. When the printing plant finally reopened, my father went back to the work he loved. The new presses were switched on and roaring to life. When the day's newspaper had been printed, the presses shuddered to a stop. Now there was a silence. In the midst of the stillness, my father's co-workers gathered around him. They presented him with a hat made of freshly printed newspaper. As my father put the hat on his head, all the printers could hear did something surprising. They told him "thank you" with their hands. They all learned how to say thank you with their hands just for him. That night my father picked up the newspaper hat that his fellow printers had given him. After adjusting the four corners, he placed it gently on my head. I didn't take off my hat, but wore it carefully to bed. I imagined I was standing next to my father on a vast printing press floor, turning lead-typed letters into words and sentences. We were wearing four-cornered newspaper hats. We were printers. Right, that was our story. I want to read the author's note in the back page because it's very important. So our author's note says, my father was a printer. He worked in the composing room of the New York Daily News for 40 years. It was the only job he'd ever had, and he loved it. In the mid-1940s, which is the time setting for this story, newspapers were the key source of daily news for Americans. Television, computers, and the internet as we know them today were yet to be invented. Newspapers were read by 85% of the American people. My father was understandably proud of his daily contribution, composing a single page of the great metropolitan newspaper that would be reproduced on giant printing presses 2 million times a day. My father was deaf. His parents and siblings could hear. Because he could not fully communicate with them, he often felt lonely, even though they loved him dearly. But he had no words to express how he felt. When my father was still a young boy, his parents sent him to live in a deaf school. There he learned sign language, the language of the deaf. Every hour of every day, he eagerly learned new words. Now he would listen to others and tell how he felt, how he thought, and finally how he imagined he would live in a hearing world. In the early 1900s, when my father was a young boy, many hearing people thought that the deaf could not learn as well as the hearing. In those days, deaf children were usually taught how to work with their hands. My father and many others were taught to be printers. This was viewed as the ideal trade for the deaf since printing was a very noisy business. My father worked in the composing room. He assembled hot metal lines of type called slugs, which were created on loud, flattering linotype machine. This was a heavy iron device with a keyboard similar to a typewriter. My father arranged the slugs along with loose metal type into a metal frame. The metal frame was then used to create a printing plate that would eventually be attached to a printing press, another noisy machine that was large as a small house. Awesome. On the back, it says this is how you can make a newspaper hat, which is really neat. So for your homework today, I'm going to upload this and see if you can make a printer's hat for fun. If you are unable to get a newspaper, you can do it with a normal sheet of paper as well. It's just going to be a smaller hat, okay? But this might be fun to make that connection with the story. Um, the message of this book is why was this the author wrote this. Never assume a person is not as good as you just because he or she is different or has a disability. It is good to have work you love and that makes you proud, right? Super good book. I thought it was very nice that all of the workers learned to say thank you with their hands to make that connection with him because he did feel so lonely. And here is that awesome picture that I will upload right after this for you guys to try. Take some pictures of me with it if you can. If you can't do it, it's okay.